12 hitmen crashed Bumpy Johnson's wedding with guns and bombs. He let them shoot first. 12 bodies dropped. The wedding finished. Then from Alcatraz, he destroyed their boss. How does a man in chains still make kings bleed? The envelope landed on Bumpy Johnson's kitchen table at 9 a.m. like a stone dropped from a roof. No stamp, no name. Just his face staring back at him crossed out in red paint, thick and dragged slow. The way you mark something you intend to destroy at your leisure, stamped hard in the corner. 6:22 p.m. Not a threat. A scheduled death. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and stale cigarette ash. Bumpy picked up the photograph, looked at it for 8 seconds, then placed it face down and picked up his fork. His eggs were cold. He ate every bite without rushing. Calvin stood by the window with his arms locked across his chest, watching Bumpy eat and feeling his stomach turn over. "You're sitting there eating breakfast like someone didn't just mail you your own funeral," he said. Bumpy set his fork down and looked up. "Because that's exactly what they want me to do instead." He pushed the plate aside and stood. "And I don't perform for people who send me photographs." Calvin crossed the room in 4 steps and put both fists on the table hard enough to slosh the coffee. "Bumpy, they are walking into that church tonight with loaded guns. Your wife is standing at that altar. There are children in those pews. You want to hand these people a slaughterhouse with flowers on every table." Bumpy looked at him the way a man looks at a wall he has already decided to walk through. His voice dropped low and airless, not angry, not loud. Just the kind of quiet that fills every corner of a room and leaves nothing to breathe. "If I cancel this wedding, every enemy I have wakes up tomorrow knowing one photograph is enough to move me. I spend the next 10 years bleeding every time some fool decides to test that." He paused and let the silence do the work. "But if I walk into that church already knowing they're coming and I've already set the cage before they step inside it, then I'm not the target tonight. Calvin, I am the trap." Calvin said nothing. He sat down, because there was nothing to say to a man who had already finished thinking 3 moves ahead of the conversation. Bumpy spent the next 6 hours turning St. Luke's Church into a killing ground that looked exactly like a house of God. He walked every aisle twice. He stood at every entrance and stared inward, calculating angles and distances and blind spots with the quiet focus of a man who understood that the difference between a massacre and a controlled outcome is measured in inches and seconds. 12 of his most trusted men were placed with surgical precision 4 as ushers at the doors, 6 filling the pews flanking the center aisle, 2 in the choir loft with clean sight lines across the entire nave. He pulled the priest into the sacristy and spoke in a voice that carried zero softness inside it. "Father, when this ceremony begins, you finish it. You do not stop reading. You do not look up from that book. You do not react to anything you hear until I tell you we are done." The priest's face went chalk white and perfectly still. But he nodded. Men who stood inside Bumpy Johnson's instructions understood at a cellular level that there was no territory outside them. By 5:47 p.m. guests were filing through the doors. The air inside the church thickened fast gardenia perfume, candle smoke, the woolen cedar smell of good suits packed into a stone space with nowhere for the heat to escape. The organ filled the nave with long, slow waves of sound. Women in white gloves settled into pews. Old men straightened their ties, and moving quietly among them, wearing Sunday shoes and pressed jackets. 12 hired killers keeping loaded weapons pressed flat and motionless against their own ribs. Bumpy stood at the altar at 6:10 p.m., 12 minutes before the stamped deadline. His face was a sealed door. No sweat, no tension, not one readable thing. But behind that locked expression, his eyes moved like a scalpel through every face in the room. Left pillar, a man standing while everyone around him sat, shoulders rigid, hands folded too tight, jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony. Back row, a man whose eyes had not traveled once toward the bride since the doors opened. Side corridor, a thumb tapping a thigh in a rhythm that belonged to a finger rehearsing a trigger, not a hymn. He turned his head exactly 2 degrees toward his best man. His lips barely moved. Left pillar, 2 in the back. Side door, wait for the first shot, then take every single one of them. The organ swelled into the processional. The bride appeared at the back of the nave. The gardenias shivered in the cold draft from the open doors, and the smell of them, sweet and heavy and completely wrong for what was about to happen, pressed into every nose in that room. 6:22 p.m. arrived like a blade dropping. The gunshot tore through the church and ripped the music in half. The bullet meant to punch through Bumpy's chest past 4 inches wide because he had already moved 1 single step left. Quiet and exact. The movement of a man whose body had rehearsed this precise moment until it lived somewhere below thought, below instinct, in the place where only pure cold decision exists. The air turned sharp and chemical in an instant, gunpowder burning through the gardenias and candle wax like a razor through cloth. Bumpy's men rose without a word and went to work. Every killer in that church revealed himself the moment that first shot left the barrel, and every single one of them was already surrounded before the sound finished bouncing off the walls. The man who fires first never controls the room. The man who decided where every bullet would land before a single gun was drawn, that man already owns it. That gunshot should have torn the room apart. 180 people trapped inside stone walls. Gunpowder detonating through gardenia perfume and hot candle wax, a rifle crack shattering off marble floors and stained glass that should have produced one thing only: blind, screaming animal panic. Women trampling each other, men throwing bodies over pews. The whole congregation crushing itself toward the exits in one mindless, terrified wave. None of it happened. That silence, that cold, impossible, suffocating silence, was the most savage thing Bumpy Johnson deployed all night. His men came out of the pews fast and clean, cutting through the frozen crowd the way a blade cuts through still water, no friction, no noise, no disturbance on the surface, voices flat and iron hard. Stay in your seat, head down. 60 seconds and it's over. People obeyed before they understood why they were obeying, because something in that tone bypassed every thinking process and reached straight into the oldest and most honest part of the human brain, the part that knows, without needing a single word of explanation, that the men speaking those words are the only thing standing between you and something you will not walk away from. The 12 hitmen had built their entire plan around chaos. They needed the crowd to explode screaming, running, bodies slamming into bodies to create the cover and confusion that lets professionals finish their work clean and disappear. What they found instead was a room that didn't move, and a response force already inside it, already positioned, already closing from every direction before a second round could be seated in any chamber. The man behind the left pillar, thick neck, gray suit, a .45 pressed flat against his ribs beneath the jacket, stepped 2 strides toward the altar and caught a forearm across his throat from behind with the force of a baseball bat swung full speed at neck height. One of Bumpy's ushers drove him backward completely off his feet and into the stone wall of the side corridor. The back of his skull hit the wall with a single, dense, wet crack that sounded nothing like anything that happens to a living person and stays living. He folded down the wall and hit the floor and did not move again. The usher turned back toward the nave without breaking stride. The camera bag man planted near the front for a clean, guaranteed kill shot directly into Bumpy's chest, spun toward the movement behind the pillar and caught a knee driven up into his ribcage with every pound of a 200-pound man stacked behind it. 2 ribs separated from his sternum with a sound like a thick green branch snapped hard across someone's knee. The woman sitting 4 feet away told investigators the next morning She had heard what she thought was a heavy book hitting the floor. She had been sitting 4 feet from a man being physically broken and processed it as furniture. The florist's assistant near the altar swung his weapon up and found the barrel seized from directly below. One of Bumpy's men had been kneeling behind the front pew since 5:30 p.m., completely motionless, breathing slow and shallow, waiting with the absolute patience of a man who had been told exactly when his 3 seconds would arrive. The gun wrenched skyward. The shot exploded into the vaulted ceiling and rained plaster dust down on the front 4 rows like dirty white ash falling from a collapsing sky. Then the florist's assistant was face first on cold granite, a knee grinding into the center of his spine with his full weight behind it. Both wrists locked and wrenched backward until the tendons screamed. His cheek pressed against stone that smelled of centuries of cold and incense, and now his own blood spreading thick and warm beneath his face. 12 men, 12 positions, 12 separate destructions, all happening inside 90 seconds of precise, suffocating violence that unfolded entirely in the shadows while the organ music stumbled once, caught itself, and drove forward, because the organist was Bumpy's man and had been given one absolute instruction regarding the possibility of stopping. It did not exist. One hitman died 8 feet from the altar. He pitched forward and his face met the granite floor with a dull, boneless impact that the people nearest him felt vibrating up through the soles of their feet before their ears processed it as sound. 2 of Bumpy's men closed around the body in under 3 seconds, backs angled outward like a wall, cutting every sight line from the nearby pews. A coat came down over the body with the calm, practiced precision of a man finishing a task he has done many times before. The bride reached the altar. Bumpy took her hand. His grip was dry and perfectly still, the grip of a man standing at the absolute center of controlled catastrophe and feeling nothing but the location of the next correct move. The priest's voice was thin as a thread pulled to its breaking point, barely holding together, trembling on every third word. But he read. Every verse. Every vow. Every word in that book from the first line to the last, because Bumpy had told him to. And in that church on that night, an instruction from Bumpy Johnson carried the same quality as the stone beneath every foot in the room. It did not shift. It did not soften. And there was absolutely nothing beneath it to fall through. By the final amen, 9 of the 12 were finished. 2 had been walked out through the side door as quietly as men stepping outside for air. 1 lay under a coat 8 feet from the altar in a stain that the candles were too far away to illuminate. A woman in the 3rd row told police she had heard a small disturbance and assumed a guest had taken ill. She had spent 17 minutes sitting 12 feet from a corpse and gone home thinking she had witnessed a beautiful ceremony. Power that needs to be seen is already shrinking. Power that moves through a room like weather everywhere at once. Visible to no one, that kind never shrinks. It just becomes the conditions everyone else lives inside. The Harlem Grand Hall hit you like a fist before you cleared the doorway. Roasted meat and spilled bourbon and 50 competing perfumes packed into air that had no room to move. The noise of 200 people bouncing off a low ceiling and coming back down into your chest like pressure. Chandeliers threw hot yellow light across 60 white-draped tables loaded with food that nobody was touching yet because the bar had been open for 20 minutes and the bar was doing the work of 10 men. On the far stage, a 6-piece band drove a slow jazz number through the heat and the noise, the trumpet cutting clean and high above everything, the bass drum underneath the whole room like a second heartbeat steady. Patient. Holding everything together by rhythm alone. It looked exactly like a wedding reception. That was Bumpy's first and most important instruction of the evening. Before a single guest walked through those doors, he had stood in the center of that room and delivered one sentence to every man on his payroll in a tone that left no interpretation available. What happened in that church is buried in that church, and anyone who walks into this room looking like it isn't gets left outside until they can fix their face. So they fixed their faces. They smiled and poured drinks and put hands on shoulders and laughed in the right places, and the room sounded exactly the way a room full of people celebrating something is supposed to sound. Bumpy stood near the bar with an untouched glass of bourbon and took the room apart, one layer at a time with his eyes. Something was wrong. Not visible wrong. Not audible wrong. Just wrong, a single instrument somewhere in the room playing slightly off pitch while everything else held. A hairline fracture running through a wall that hadn't broken the surface yet. He stood completely still and let his eyes work slowly across every table, every corner, every moving body in the room. Nothing obvious, nothing he could point at. Just the cold, specific pressure in the center of his chest that had been there at 6:10 p.m. when he'd clocked the first killer, by the pillar that same pressure, sitting in the same place, telling him the same thing. Gerald, head waiter, 11 years at the Grand Hall. A man who could navigate a packed room of 60 tables without once checking a number was moving wrong, too fast between stations. Hands working and retreating with the nervous efficiency of a man trying very hard not to let his eyes land on a specific point in the room. They kept dropping to the floor along the east wall and snapping back up with the involuntary speed of a man correcting a flinch he can't fully control. Down. Snap. Down again. The trumpet chair on the bandstand was empty. No break announced. No substitution made. The trumpet player had simply ceased to occupy his chair at some point in the last few minutes, and the band had closed around the empty space and kept playing as though it had always been a five-piece. And beneath the serving table, pushed against the east wall, nearly invisible under the fall of the white linen cloth, a thin black wire ran flat along the baseboard all the way to the kitchen door. Straight, deliberate. The kind of wire that is going somewhere specific, and when it gets there, it does something that nobody in the room will survive long enough to describe. Bumpy set his bourbon glass on the bar without producing a sound. He turned to Darnell, former middleweight boxer, hands that looked like they'd been cast from something denser than bone. A man whose nervous system appeared to have been surgically disconnected from the concept of urgency sometime in his early 30s, and spoke at a volume calibrated to travel exactly 2 feet. East side, clear it toward the front doors. Tell them the champagne toast is starting up front. Take your time. No rush. 4 minutes. What Darnell did next was extraordinary in its absolute invisibility. He and 3 others moved through the east half of that room like current through water, a hand at an elbow here, a smile and a redirecting gesture there. Guests flowing naturally toward the front entrance, without a single person understanding that they were being evacuated from a space that had a countdown running beneath it. The band kept playing. The bar kept pouring. The smell of roasted meat and bourbon held in the warm air, and nothing on the surface of the room shifted at all. In the kitchen corridor, Gerald had his back against the tile wall between a humming refrigerator and a floor-to-ceiling stack of wine crates with 2 of Bumpy's men standing close enough that he could smell the starch in their shirts. He lasted 45 seconds. The bomb had been planted 2 hours before the reception by the florist's assistant. The same man who had slipped out through the church's side exit during the ceremony using forged vendor credentials and a cart of white roses to walk straight through the service entrance without a second look from anyone. The device sat beneath the serving table, wired to a detonator behind the wine crates, timed to trigger at exactly 8:00 p.m. during the champagne toast when the room would be packed and still and everybody in it standing in one place. Gerald had been paid $400 in cash to make certain nobody touched that tablecloth for any reason for the remainder of the evening. He was crying so hard by the end that his words arrived in pieces. Roosevelt, 6'4", 240 pounds of a man, whose entire professional existence had been the calm movement of extremely heavy objects, walked to the serving table, lifted the linen, examined what was underneath it for 3 seconds with the focused detachment of a man reading a work order, wrapped the device in the tablecloth, walked through the kitchen, shouldered the rear exit open, crossed the back alley in 8 strides, and threw it over the chain-link fence into the vacant lot beyond with one long, clean, unhurried motion. The same motion he had used on the docks 10,000 times before. Effortless. Complete. Final. The blast came at 7:51 p.m., 9 minutes before the trigger time, in an empty lot, killing no one. The explosion rolled through 3 city blocks. Windows cracked across the street. Car alarms screamed in both directions and kept screaming. A crater 4 feet wide tore open in the frozen ground, and the shrapnel thrown outward from it had 9 minutes earlier been engineered to do to a room full of celebrating people what it now did to frozen dirt and dead weeds. Inside the grand hall, the band played on. The champagne was poured near the front doors exactly as announced. Bumpy walked back onto the reception floor, shook hands with a city councilman standing 20 feet from where that wire had run along the baseboard, and danced with his wife while the sound of the detonation still moved slowly over Harlem like the last echo of something enormous. 12 dead. 1 crater in an empty lot. 1 reception finished without a single innocent person touched. The city counted the bodies in the morning and called it a massacre. They counted wrong. The only number that told the true story of that night was the one nobody printed. The people who walked into that church and that ballroom and walked back home. The ones history forgets are usually the ones who made sure history had people left to write it. The handcuffs went on at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday in front of 40 people on a Harlem sidewalk. 2 federal agents. 1 police captain. Photographers who had somehow known exactly where to stand and exactly when to raise their cameras. The flashbulbs popped like small explosions in the morning cold, and the next day every newspaper in New York ran the same photograph: Bumpy Johnson in cuffs, being walked to a black car, head up, face unreadable. The headlines called it a collapse. Harlem boss finally broken. Johnson empire crumbles. The king goes down. Every single word was wrong. Calvin watched from across the street with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw tight enough to crack a back tooth. That evening, he sat in the back room of a Harlem restaurant with 3 of Bumpy's most senior men, and nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, one of them, an older man named Desmond, who had worked with Bumpy for 14 years, put his glass down and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. He knew this was coming. He knew it before the wedding. He didn't run. He looked around the table. So ask yourself why a man who could have run didn't run. Nobody had an answer that night. The answer was sitting in a cell on an island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz in 1952 was 36 acres of cold concrete and colder water, a place the federal government had designed specifically to make men disappear from the world without killing them. The wind off the bay cut through the cell blocks like something with a grudge. The walls were thick enough to swallow sound whole. Men went in and came out years later with something permanently removed from behind their eyes. Bumpy Johnson arrived, was processed, was assigned a cell, and within 72 hours had mapped every power structure on that island with the same methodical patience he had used to map St. Luke's Church 6 months earlier. He requested writing materials on his 4th day. The request was granted. He was, after all, a model prisoner, polite, quiet, no trouble to anyone. The guards liked him. That was not an accident. The letters started arriving in Harlem 3 weeks after his transfer. They were careful letters, nothing incriminating, nothing that could be held against him in any court. They were letters about patience, about observation, about the specific kind of foolishness that gets men killed when they move too fast without enough information. He wrote to Calvin, "A man who cannot be reached cannot be pressured. A man who cannot be pressured cannot be made to make mistakes. I am currently unreachable. Consider what that means for the people who put me here." Calvin read that letter 4 times. Then he started making visits. What Bumpy built from inside Alcatraz over the following months was invisible to everyone watching from the outside. The federal agents who had celebrated his arrest went back to their offices and their files and their other cases. The newspaper photographers moved on to the next story. The people who believed the headlines believed the story was over. Inside Harlem, the structure Bumpy had spent 15 years building held its shape. The men he had placed, the relationships he had cultivated, the specific loyalties he had earned through years of being exactly as reliable as he promised, none of that disappeared because its architect was on an island. Organizations built on fear collapse when the man at the top is removed. Organizations built on trust become load-bearing walls. But what nobody outside Bumpy's inner circle understood was that his absence was doing something his presence never could have done. Every enemy he had, every rival, every federal informant, every ambitious younger man watching for an opening had to operate now without knowing what Bumpy knew, without knowing what instructions he had left, without knowing which of the men around them had been quietly reporting back to a cell in Alcatraz for the past 8 months. That uncertainty was more paralyzing than any gun. In the spring of 1953, a man named Victor, a mid-level operator who had been quietly expanding into territory, Bumpy's people controlled. Moving carefully and slowly while the boss was locked away, received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page describing, in specific and accurate detail, 3 conversations Victor had believed were completely private. The letter contained no threats. It required no response. It simply demonstrated, with calm and surgical precision, that the distance between Harlem and Alcatraz was not the obstacle Victor had been counting on. Victor stopped expanding the following week. He never expanded again. Bumpy Johnson spent 3 years on that island. He read. He wrote. He observed. He maintained the kind of absolute surface calm that makes the men watching you start to wonder what you know that they don't. He was released in 1955 and walked out of Alcatraz the same way he had walked into every room for 30 years first. Unhurried, and already knowing where everything was. A cage only holds the body. Everything that makes a man dangerous lives somewhere the locks can't reach. Albert Anastasia was not a cautious man. That had always been his greatest strength, and it had always been, to anyone watching closely enough, his most obvious flaw. By 1957, Anastasia controlled the most feared murder operation in the American underworld, Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm that had reportedly been responsible for somewhere between 400 and 1,000 deaths depending on which prosecutor you asked, and how badly they wanted the number to land. He was known as the Lord High Executioner. He had earned that title by being faster to order a killing than any other man at any table he had ever sat at. Speed was his identity. Decisiveness was his brand. What it was not was wisdom. Bumpy had watched Anastasia for years the way a man watches weather, not because he feared it, but because he understood that weather that is not respected eventually destroys things you cannot rebuild. By 1957, Anastasia had become a specific kind of dangerous. Not the clean dangerous of a man with power and discipline, the messy dangerous of a man with power and no ceiling, a man who had started making decisions that created problems for people far above his position. People who sat at tables where the decisions were made in quiet rooms and implemented without announcement. Anastasia had made enemies in those rooms, serious enemies, the kind who did not raise their voices and did not send photographs with red slashes and timestamps, the kind who simply decided, and then waited for the correct moment. Bumpy was not the one who made the decision about Anastasia. He was not in those rooms. What he was a man who understood exactly which direction the wind was blowing 4 months before the event that would confirm it, and who understood that in this specific situation. The most powerful thing he could do was ensure that the right information reached the right ears at exactly the right moment without any fingerprints attached to the delivery. The wedding had become the mechanism. The 12 hitmen sent to kill Bumpy at his own wedding in 1951 had been ordered by Anastasia, a fact that existed in the private knowledge of several men who sat at those quiet tables. It had never been confirmed publicly. It had never needed to be. But in the months following Bumpy's release from Alcatraz, that fact began appearing in conversations it had never appeared in before. Not as an accusation, not as a complaint, just as information, mentioned in passing, placed carefully in the awareness of men who were already assembling a case against a man who had become impossible to manage. Bumpy mentioned it once to a trusted intermediary, in a private room, in a tone so casual it could not be characterized as anything other than conversation. "The man sent 12 people into a church full of women and children," he said, his voice carrying the flat weight of a man describing a weather event. 12 people with guns and a bomb into a house of God at a wedding. That kind of judgment doesn't improve with age. The intermediary carried that observation to exactly the right place. On the morning of October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat down in the barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan at 10:15 a.m. for his regular morning shave. He was alone. His bodyguard had been sent to park the car. The barbershop smelled like shaving cream and warm towels and bay rum. Ordinary smells. The smells of an ordinary Tuesday morning in a hotel where powerful men came to maintain their appearances. 2 men walked in at 10:20 a.m. They moved to the chair. They fired multiple times at close range. Anastasia was dead before the hot towel hit the tile floor. The murder was never officially solved. No one was ever charged. The investigation produced nothing prosecutable and was eventually filed away in the category of cases that the people responsible for solving them understood. At some fundamental level, would never be solved because the people who could solve them had no interest in doing so. Bumpy was in Harlem when it happened. He heard the news from a man who came into the restaurant where he was eating lunch and announced it to the room the way you announce any piece of news about a public figure who has died. Bumpy listened, nodded once, and returned to his food. The barber's chair closed one chapter. No announcement. No explanation. No one left holding the evidence of a decision. In this world, the men who last longest are never the ones who pull the trigger. They are the ones who understood, months in advance, exactly where the trigger was already pointed. Bumpy Johnson walked out of his final federal sentence in the late 1950s and stepped back into a Harlem that had been rewired while he was gone. The streets looked the same. The buildings, the corners, the barbershops and restaurants, and the particular way the light fell on 116th Street in the early morning, all of it unchanged on the surface. But the current running underneath had shifted. The old economy that had structured Harlem's underworld for 2 decades numbers. Protection. Controlled territories with understood borders was being pushed out by something faster, dirtier, and far harder to manage. Heroin had arrived. Not as a new problem, as a flood. The younger men who had grown up watching Bumpy build his operation had a different model now. They had seen how fast heroin money moved. They had watched neighborhoods drown in it and watched the men selling it get rich faster than anyone had gotten rich before, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion that speed was the point. Move fast. Take territory. Get the money before someone else gets it first. Bumpy sat across from Calvin in the back room of a Harlem restaurant 3 days after his release and listened to a 2-hour briefing on the current state of every significant operation in the borough. When Calvin finished, Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me which blocks have the most overdoses." Calvin blinked. That was not the question he had expected. "What?" "The overdoses," Bumpy said again, his voice carrying the patient weight of a man who only intends to repeat himself once. "Which corners are producing the most bodies? Because those corners are being run by men who don't understand that you cannot build anything permanent on top of a cemetery." Calvin gave him the numbers. Bumpy listened and did not write anything down. What Bumpy did in the months following his release was the opposite of what every ambitious younger operator expected. He did not move to reclaim lost territory. He did not make public demonstrations of returning power. He did not push into the heroin trade despite the money it was generating. He consolidated. He strengthened the structures that had held while he was imprisoned. He reinforced relationships with the men who had maintained discipline and distanced himself quietly and completely from the men who had not. He also, with a consistency that confused people who were watching for conventional power moves, invested in the blocks he controlled. Not as a performance, as maintenance, a landlord who kept buildings from collapsing, a businessman who kept specific Harlem institutions open when they would otherwise have closed. The community did not know the full shape of what he was doing, and he did not explain it to them. Explanation was not the point. One evening, a younger man, a fast-moving operator named Marcus, who had built a significant heroin distribution network across 4 blocks during Bumpy's imprisonment, requested a meeting. He arrived with 2 men behind him and the particular energy of someone who has mistaken recent success for permanent position. He sat down across from Bumpy and explained, with more confidence than the situation warranted, that he controlled significant territory now and that he expected that to be respected going forward. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "Marcus, how old are the men you're selling to?" Marcus shifted in his chair. "I don't track that." "You should," Bumpy said, "because 3 of the last 6 men found dead on your blocks this year were 22 years old, and the one before that was 19. He let that sit in the air between them. I built something in this borough that lasted 20 years because I understood one thing that fast men never understand, that the only operation worth running is one that the neighborhood can survive. You cannot survive what you're building. And when it collapses, it will collapse on top of everyone standing near it." He stood up, which ended the meeting. "Take your 2 men and go think about what I just said." Marcus left. He did not push back, because even in a Harlem that had changed around him, the specific gravity of Bumpy Johnson's stillness in a room was not a thing that fast young men with new money found easy to argue against. Power built on violence peaks fast and burns out faster. Power built on structure, on discipline, on the patient maintenance of something people depend on, that kind does not peak. It simply becomes the ground everyone else is standing on, and nobody questions the ground until it's already gone. The federal agents started showing up in pairs by 1962. Different faces, same routine, parked outside restaurants where Bumpy ate, sitting in cars across the street from buildings he visited, appearing at the edges of his day with the patient, deliberate visibility of men who wanted to be seen. This was not surveillance. This was pressure. The government had learned that Bumpy Johnson could not be broken by a raid or a headline, so they had switched to something slower and more corrosive: the constant friction of being watched, followed, documented, the accumulated weight of never having a single hour that belonged entirely to you. Bumpy noticed. He said nothing about it for 3 weeks. Then one morning he told Calvin, "They're not looking for evidence. They already know they won't find anything worth using. They're trying to make me tired." He poured his coffee and set the pot down. "The question is whether they outlast me or I outlast them." He was 61 years old. His heart had been giving him warnings for 2 years, a tightness in the chest after exertion, a heaviness that wasn't there at 50. The particular fatigue of a body that has been running at full capacity for 4 decades and has begun, quietly and without drama, to present its accounting. His doctor told him in plain language to reduce his stress, limit his hours, and under no circumstances continue carrying the operational weight of a criminal organization across a borough that was fracturing along new fault lines every 6 months. Bumpy listened to every word of that advice with genuine attention and thanked the doctor for his time. He changed nothing. What he did do, and this was the move that nobody around him fully understood until years later, was begin systematically narrowing the territory he was responsible for. Not retreating, not surrendering, deliberately contracting the perimeter of what he controlled to the point where every remaining piece of it was solid, tested and maintainable by men he trusted completely. He walked away from 3 revenue streams in 1963 that would have required him to manage relationships with people he did not trust. He ended 2 alliances that had become expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. He reduced his operation to its skeleton and then reinforced every bone. Calvin pushed back hard on the revenue decisions. They were sitting in the back room late on a Wednesday night, and Calvin put the numbers on the table and made the case with the blunt arithmetic of a man who had spent 30 years watching money move. Bumpy, you are walking away from significant income at a moment when the federal pressure is already costing us. This is the wrong time to get smaller. Bumpy looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he looked at Calvin. You know what kills more men in this business than bullets, he said. Overextension. A man who controls 10 blocks and truly controls them is 10 times more dangerous than a man who claims 40 blocks and is actually just renting them from people who haven't decided to take them yet. He pushed the papers back across the table. I'm not getting smaller. Calvin, I'm getting solid. There's a difference that you can only see from the outside after the fact, and I don't have the patience to wait for you to see it from there. Calvin took the papers and said nothing, because he had been having this argument with Bumpy Johnson for 30 years, and his record in those arguments was not impressive. The federal pressure intensified through 1964 and 1965. 2 men in Bumpy's outer circle were flipped and became informants. Bumpy was informed of this within 2 weeks of it happening. He had long since built a system for knowing exactly this kind of information before it could be used against him, and he responded by simply removing both men from any position where the information they carried had operational value. No violence, no confrontation. They were quietly made irrelevant, which is a more complete destruction than anything physical. By 1967, Bumpy Johnson was 66 years old, and the map of what he controlled was a fraction of what it had been at his peak. But every part of that map was his in a way that nothing on the larger map had ever been clean. Quiet, maintained by men who had earned their positions over years and understood what they were protecting and why. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson sat down for dinner at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street, a place he had eaten at hundreds of times, a place that smelled like fried chicken and warm bread and decades of the same conversations had by the same kinds of people. He ordered his meal. He ate. He was talking with the people at his table when his hand went still on the table and his head dropped forward, and he was gone before anyone in the room had time to process what they were seeing. Heart failure. 67 years old. At a dinner table, surrounded by people he knew. In a restaurant on a street he had walked for 40 years. Not in a car ambush. Not in a raid. Not with handcuffs or a headline or a bullet finding him in a church at 6:22 p.m. the way someone had once carefully planned. Every man who had ever tried to end Bumpy Johnson's life with violence had failed. The only thing that finally reached him was the 40 years of weight he had carried without complaint and without visible cost until the moment his body quietly presented the final bill. The hardest ending to achieve in a world built on violence is a quiet one, and the men who manage it are the ones who understood, earlier than everyone else, that survival was always the point. The news reached Harlem the way important news always reaches a place that has been waiting for it without admitting it was waiting fast, and from multiple directions at once, and with a quality of weight that made people stop moving for a moment before they started again. By midnight on July 7th, 1968, every significant operator in the borough knew that Bumpy Johnson was dead. By the following morning, the question that mattered, the question that would determine what the next chapter of Harlem looked like, was already being asked in back rooms and on corners and in the careful silences between men who were calculating what the absence meant for their specific position. The question was simple: who fills it? The answer, when it came, was nothing like what the men asking the question had expected. Calvin gathered the senior men 3 days after the funeral in the same back room where Bumpy had held every significant meeting for the past decade. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space that has absorbed too many serious conversations to smell like anything else. Calvin sat at the head of the table, Bumpy's chair, which he had never sat in before, and which everyone in the room noticed immediately, and looked at the faces around him for a long time before he spoke. "He left instructions," Calvin said, "not a question. A statement delivered with the flat certainty of a man reading from a document he had already memorized. Not for everything. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in accounting for every possibility in advance, because he understood that the world changes faster than any written plan can track." He paused. But for the things that mattered, he left instructions. And the first instruction was this: nobody expands for 18 months. Nobody takes new territory. Nobody starts new conflicts. We hold what we have, and we hold it clean, and we wait. A younger man at the far end of the table, a sharp-faced operator named Dennis, who had been building his reputation carefully for 3 years and had been waiting with increasing impatience for the kind of opening that a leadership vacuum creates, leaned forward. "With respect, Calvin, 18 months is a long time in the current environment. There are people outside this room who are not going to observe a mourning period for Bumpy Johnson. There are people outside this room who are already moving." Calvin looked at him with an expression that had not changed since the beginning of the meeting. "I know," he said. "Bumpy knew too. That's why the second instruction was a list of names." He let that land for 3 full seconds. The names of every person outside this room who he believed would move within 30 days of his death. He gave us the list. He gave us the recommended responses. He gave us the reasoning behind each recommendation so that we could adapt it to whatever the actual situation turned out to be. Calvin's voice was steady and without drama, which made it more frightening than any raised voice in the room could have been. "Bumpy Johnson has been gone for 72 hours, and he is already telling us what to do next. I suggest we listen." Dennis sat back in his chair and said nothing for the rest of the meeting. What followed in the 18 months after Bumpy's death was from the outside, almost invisible. No major territorial wars, no public power struggles, no vacuum filling itself with the spectacular violence that typically marks the end of a dominant figure's control. The operations Bumpy had maintained continued with the quiet reliability of machinery that has been well maintained. Not exciting, not dramatic, simply functional. 3 of the operators on Bumpy's list made moves within the first 30 days. All 3 found that the responses waiting for them had been designed by someone who had anticipated their specific strategies with uncomfortable accuracy. 2 pulled back. 1 did not pull back far enough and suffered the kind of precise, targeted consequence that sends a message to everyone watching without requiring any public statement. Harlem did not erupt. It did not fracture. It adapted the way a body adapts to the loss of something central by redistributing the load across the structures that remain. The structures Bumpy had spent 20 years building were load-bearing in ways that nobody had fully appreciated until they were the only thing left to carry the weight. By 1970, the landscape had shifted and settled into a new shape that was different from what Bumpy had built, but carried the clear architecture of his influence in its bones. The men who had maintained discipline held their ground. The men who had not found that the ground they were standing on was less solid than it had appeared. Harlem did not become a different city after Bumpy Johnson. It became the next version of the same city, shaped by forces he had set in motion years before he sat down for his last meal on 132nd Street. The people who keep a city from burning are almost never the ones the city remembers. They are the ones who made sure there was still a city left to do the remembering. Here is what the newspapers got wrong about Bumpy Johnson. They covered the arrests. They covered the body counts. They covered the federal cases and the Alcatraz transfer and the Anastasia killing and the years of surveillance that produced. In the end, very little that could be used against a man who had spent 40 years ensuring that the most important things he did left no surface for a charge to attach to. They covered the death heart failure. Wells Restaurant, July 7th, 1968, with the brief and slightly relieved energy of journalists closing a file they had kept open for 2 decades. What they never covered, because it was not visible, and because visibility was the one thing Bumpy Johnson had spent his entire career refusing to provide, was the actual architecture of what he had built and what it meant that it survived him. The legend that grew around Bumpy Johnson after his death focused, inevitably, on the wedding. 12 hitmen, 1 church, 6 minutes of controlled violence that left every attacker dead and the ceremony completed. That story spread the way vivid stories spread fast, with embellishments, accumulating details that may or may not have been present in the original event, but that felt true to the shape of the man being described. By the 1970s, the wedding story had become the kind of story that gets told in Harlem barbershops and back rooms as a fixed piece of neighborhood mythology. But the wedding was 6 minutes. Bumpy Johnson was 40 years. The 6 seconds of a trigger being pulled, or in this case, the 6 minutes of a church being cleared, is the part of a story that gets remembered because it is loud and specific and produces an outcome that can be described in a single sentence. What does not get remembered, what almost never survives the journey from event to legend, is the 6 years of patience that made the 6 minutes possible. Bumpy had known, months before that wedding, that the attack was being organized. He had known the approximate timeline. He had known enough of the operational shape to understand what he was walking into. He walked into it anyway, not because he was reckless, but because he understood something about power that most men in his position never learned. The response to a threat is not the defense you build. It is the decision you make about whether to let the threat reveal itself completely before you answer it. Bumpy let every enemy in that church fire first. He let them commit fully to the attack before his response began. And because they had committed fully, because they had no reserve and no exit strategy and no contingency for the possibility that their target was already 3 moves ahead of their plan, every single one of them was destroyed completely. That patience, that specific, disciplined, almost inhuman patience was the thing the legend never captured. Because patience does not photograph well. Because patience does not produce a sentence that fits in a headline. Because patience looks, from the outside, exactly like nothing happening, right up until the moment it looks like everything happening at once. Calvin lived until 1981. In the last years of his life, he gave several interviews to writers and journalists who were assembling accounts of Harlem's history. In every interview, when asked about Bumpy Johnson, he said a version of the same thing. He said, "People ask me what made Bumpy different from every other man I knew in that business, and I always tell them the same answer, and the answer always disappoints them because it's not dramatic. What made Bumpy different was that he never needed to win right now. Every other man I knew needed to win right now, needed the room to know they had won, needed the story to land immediately, needed the result to be visible and attributed and acknowledged. Bumpy could win 6 months from now and be perfectly comfortable with nobody knowing he had won at all. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen in a human being, and I have never seen it since." The barber's chair at the Park Sheraton closed one era on a Tuesday morning in October 1957. A wedding in Harlem had opened the sequence 6 years before. Between those 2 events, not a single moment had been accidental. Not a single outcome had been unplanned. And the man responsible for the chain connecting them had spent every step of it looking exactly like a man with nothing particular on his mind. The board was never empty. It was never unattended. Every piece on it had been placed by the same hand, moved by the same patience, and protected by the same fundamental understanding that the most powerful position in any game is not the one that looks powerful. It is the one that is still standing when every other position has been taken off the board. Truth does not survive because it is the loudest story in the room. It survives because it is the one still standing after every louder story has finished burning itself out. 12 hitmen walked into that church to end one man. They never walked out. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive 40 years because he was the most violent man in Harlem. He survived because he was the most patient. The bullet meant to kill him at 6:22 p.m. missed by 4 inches. Every enemy after that missed by a lifetime. A city never remembers who kept it standing. It only knows that it's still here. If you were standing at that altar when the first shot cracked through the air, would you have stepped left or run for the door? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story hit you hard, smash like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We drop a new untold story every single day. Comment right now. Were you Team Bumpy, or would you have canceled that wedding?